Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located here in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. And today we're continuing on my little mini-series of Australian Lutheran Synods, where we are going to discuss the differences between all the Australian Lutheran Synods. This is episode 3. This is our second video on talking about the different doctrines of the different synods in Australia. So my first video, we went through a historical analysis. In the previous video, we went through the different churches' views on not really church fellowship, but particularly on communion fellowship. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of women serving in the church. So here we're particularly looking at, do women serve during the divine liturgy? Some churches may have deaconesses, and they may have a women's guild or something like that. Women might help out in the church by vacuuming the carpets, or taking care of maybe the paraments on the altar. That's not really what I'm meaning by serving in church. I mean, pretty much most of the synods, even the more strict synods, do have women serving the church in some regard. Whether they're a women's guild, altar guild, deaconess, something like that, women are involved. When we talk about women serving in church, I'm more particularly talking about women serving during service. Are women up the front? Are they doing prayers? Are they doing the readings? Are they assisting with communion? Something like that. And today we're going to go through what do all the different churches teach in regards to women serving in the church. I'm going to kick off with the first synod, the biggest synod, the Lutheran Church of Australia, the LCA, or officially now the LCA-NZ, the Lutheran Church of Australia and New Zealand. And when I originally put together this list, the LCA didn't have women pastors yet, but they did have women serving in the church, basically doing practically everything a pastor could do. They could do the readings, they could lead the prayers, they could do a lay reading service, they could assist with Holy Communion. They just weren't allowed to write their own sermons, consecrate the elements, or administer absolution or baptism, unless it was an emergency. And that was the LCA's original teaching, though there were cases where women did do things that they weren't allowed to do, particularly if you go and check out my other YouTube channel, my personal channel, The Order of Knight George. I have a video on there about the Day of Action scandal, where a few years ago, a bunch of congregations tried to rebel against the fact that the LCA did not have women pastors, and a bunch of women got up and led the service as pastors anyway, preaching sermons that they wrote and consecrating the elements. Now, there was a bunch of congregations that were said to have been involved in this Day of Action scandal, but I couldn't verify all the reports and rumors about which congregations were and weren't involved. The congregations mentioned in that video were the ones that I could confirm did have women get up the front and consecrate the elements and preach their own sermons. So that was already going on in the LCA already, and there was no discipline for that. But now, none of that matters, because the LCA just has women's ordination. So they got pastors serving in the church, and this isn't even just, on paper they, could have women pastors, because when they first brought it in, they didn't instantly ordain women. They just removed the statement from the Thesis of Agreement that said women couldn't be pastors, so they opened up the floor for there to be women pastors. But as of the recording of this video, they're already now ordained a few women, so there are actual women pastors serving in the LCA. Other than that, most of the other micro-synods in Australia, although when we get towards the more Pentecostal ones, like Edgar Mayer's group and stuff like that, they do have women pastors, but we'll get to those when we get to those. Other than that, all the conservative confessional micro-synods in Australia don't have women's ordination. And actually a majority of these groups don't have women serving in the service at all. So there will be a few that do allow women to serve in some roles, like the LCA did, where they could get up and maybe lead prayers or do the readings or help out with Holy Communion or maybe do a lay reading service. However, most of the conservative Lutheran synods in Australia don't allow that. Women just aren't allowed to serve. Some churches, like my church body, the coelc, we don't have lay people serving at all, with the exception of, like, you know, acolytes who do the practical sides of the church. Like, they can carry things, but they don't do anything relevant to, like, reading scriptures or, you know, anything to do with word and sacrament. Now, there are other churches, though, that will allow lay men to do those roles, and we're going to discuss those churches and those differences when we get to later things like lay reading, lay preaching, lay distribution, and stuff like that. But those churches that allow lay men to do those roles often, most of the time, won't allow lay women to do those functions at all. So rather than go through each individual church and discuss all the doctrines, I'm basically just going to give you a list of those churches that don't have women doing anything in the service at all. And again, like when I say nothing in the service, I'm not meaning like, oh, they didn't help out with the paraments. You know, it's just a lot of churches will have female organists. So if you count that as serving in the church, then that would be women serving. But when I say women serving, I'm meaning not the practical sides of the service, I'm meaning the word and the sacrament. So these churches don't allow women to be lay readers, don't allow them to read the scriptures, don't allow them to lead prayers, stuff like that. They may be doing some of the practical things like musicians, but that's about as far as they go. And the church bodies that don't allow women to do any functions in the divine service, you have the ELCR, you have the ELSA, you have the OELC, the AELC, the ex-AELC independent groups, the CLC group, the Aletheia or Allies, the St. Jude the Apostle Independent Congregation, my church body, the coelc, the St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church run by Pastor Vanderhawk, the Cassia Eldona Little Micro Synod, and of course the brand new Lutheran Mission Australia. Now, I have heard that there have been situations in some of the new congregations leaving the LCA that they might have women serving at the moment, but that's just kind of something they inherited from the LCA. They are, according to what I heard from the leadership in the LMA, they are not wanting to have women serve in the church, and if there are situations where that is happening, they are working to phase that out. So they may be taking a bit of a slow approach in some situations. So if anybody comes to me and say, hey, but I actually went to this LMA service and they had a woman doing the readings, what I heard from the LMA themselves is that they are supporting that practice, and where it is happening, it's kind of like we're giving a bit of grace because these people have just left the LCA and we're going to phase out that practice. So, yeah, I just want to put that out there that if anyone goes, but I did hear that they had a woman doing, it may be happening. I'm not going to say it's not happening, but where it is happening, it's not meant to be happening, and their goal in the future is that they won't have women serving in those functions in the church. Now, however, there was one little group that I skipped over there, and that's the Growth Lutheran Network. That's Pastor Michael Parker's little group that he formed. I do have in my chart, do women serve in the church? And I have under them, it says no, but I've got a footnote next to it. And this is because the GLN has restrictions on women serving during the divine service. Women are not permitted to distribute Holy Communion, but they do make exceptions for things like the Bible readings. So, basically the GLN was drawing a distinction between leading roles and more assisting roles. They considered things like distributing Holy Communion as still like a leading role, so the women weren't allowed to distribute Holy Communion, and the women weren't allowed to lead the prayers. They don't have women lay readers, but when it comes things to like a lay lector, like letting the woman get up and read the Bible lessons for the day, they were allowing that to take place. So the GLN does allow women to serve in the church service, but But it's very interesting. It's a tricky situation because theologically they're taking a similar stance against women serving in the church that all the other little micro-synods are taking. The reason they have women serving in a certain capacity is because they don't see it as like a leading teaching position. They go, yeah, if she's leading prayers and distributing Holy Communion, those are clearly leading roles. But if she's reading a Bible lesson, well, that's not really a leading teaching role. And what is interesting is that is kind of theologically accurate. I have discussed this on a video about lay lectors and whether we in the coelc would allow lay lectors. The Lutherans did make a distinction between like teaching, that's reading a sermon, and just reading Bible lessons. The early Lutherans didn't see this as a teaching role. However, we in the coelc don't allow it because we say, look, if there's a pastor who's present to read the scriptures, there's no need for a layperson to read the scriptures. So even if it was theoretically possible for a layperson to do because it's not a leading teaching role, it would still not be appropriate and it could create some confusion. So we should just restrict it to the male pastor who's leading the service. There's also no need for it. See, the reason we have people like organists and that playing is, one, because not all pastors are musically trained, and two, well, it's very hard for the pastor to be both playing the organ and up the front leading the service. So there are practical reasons to have somebody else doing the music. Pastors don't have to do everything. And so when there's something that isn't a leading teaching role in the church, it is permissible for lay people to do. But when it's one of those grey areas like reading the Bible lessons, if it's a grey area, it's better to err on the side of caution and just have the pastor do it. So the GLN doesn't have women lay readers or women lay distributors or women leading prayers, but they do allow women lay lectors. There are then the three other little groups we'll just look at. There's the LCMC group in Wagga Wagga. Of course, they have women's ordination. That was not the main reason, but part of the reason why this group left the LCA in the first place, because the LCA at that point did not have women pastors. I have actually talked to the LCMC since the LCA now ordains women and asked would they be interested in returning back to the LCA now that the LCA does have women pastors, and since women's ordination was like the main reason they left, now that the LCA has it, why not come back? And the answer I got was, there's other issues involved and they're not really interested in returning to the LCA. Maybe the fact that the LCA now have women pastors may open up some grounds for, like, you know, cooperation and fellowship, but that's for them to sort out. The other groups that do have women pastors is, of course, the Living Waters group in Mildura and also Edgar Mayer's Living Grace group in Toowoomba. Although, again, this one is something that needs a little bit more explanation because, strangely enough, I'm not sure how it goes in other countries, but in Australia, many of the people who were against women's ordination were either your really conservative confessionals or your Pentecostals. See, this is interesting because the Pentecostals were often very literalists when it comes to the Bible. So they were creationists and they rejected women's ordination, but then they looked at passages about speaking in tongues and miracles in the scripture and said, well, we can do that too. And so what's funny is that originally Edgar Mayer and a lot of the people in the LCA that supported Edgar Mayer, they were pushing for things like this new apostolic revival, these apostolic gifts, this Pentecostal movement in the LCA. But they were the same people that were also against women's ordination. And when Edgar Mayer first left the LCA back in 2017, at that point in time, his congregation did not have women pastors. And I'm not sure how they went with, like, lay women serving in the church. I'd assume they had that, but they didn't have female pastors. Yes, they did have women get up the front and do things like preaching, but that was because they were moved by the Spirit to get up and speak at that point in time, but they weren't female pastors. Now, I don't know exactly the year, but he left back in 2017, and since then, Edgar Mayer has changed his position on women's ordination, and his own wife has been ordained as a pastor for their church. But originally, the Edgar Mayer and those who supported his movement were actually some of the people who were also fighting against women's ordination. And that really kind of wraps up this episode. There's not much more I can say on this matter, so we might get on with our next video, where we'll talk about women's suffrage. Can women vote in the church? I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.